I'm a neuroscientist. I'm interested in the brain. I'm interested in consciousness. But really, I've come to realize over the last few years that I'm really interested in worlds. I'm interested in the way that being a conscious being fundamentally is about being in a world. When you emerge screaming from the womb as a newborn, you are thrown into a world. When you descend into REM sleep at night, you emerge in a world that is very similar, but not quite the same as the normal waking world. And when you inhale 30 milligrams of a drug like DMT, which is what I'm particularly interested in, you enter worlds far stranger than any of those, and that seem to bear no relationship to the normal waking world. So whenever I speak to people about DMT, which I seem to do quite a lot these days, they all say, yes, okay, it's an astonishing experience, it's incredible, it's amazing, it's unbelievable, etc., but is it real? And this is a really difficult question, and I'm not going to promise to have a definitive answer, but I'm going to perhaps point towards how we might think about this problem. I think part of the problem with this question really is that it's often very poorly formulated. And when people ask that question, is it real, they don't really know what they mean by real. You know, what is the difference between a real world and an unreal world? And in a sense, all worlds we experience are kind of real. The dream world is real in that you are experiencing a world. But that seems kind of different, right, from the world we're experiencing now, what we might call a sensed world. Chris spoke about a world that is connected to the environment, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So I will start with my kind of fundamental axiom, which is that your world, what we call your phenomenal world, your own personal, subjective world, the only world you will ever know, is always built from information generated by your brain. To some of you that will make some kind of sense, to others perhaps not. So I'm going to spend quite a bit of time actually thinking about, first of all, what is information, and how the brain generates information and how that relates to the world you experience. And then we can try and relate that to the DMT world. This was written by one of my favorite authors, Hermann Hesse, almost 100 years to the day, I would suggest. If the outside world fell in ruins, one of us would be capable of building it up again from mountain and stream, tree and leaf, root and blossom. All that is shaped by nature lies modeled in us. And whilst that was written 100 years ago now, it perfectly encapsulates how we think about the worlds constructed by your brain. We might say in modern neuroscience parlance, your phenomenal world is a model of the environment built from information. So what is information? If I ask 10 of you now for a definition of information, put your phones away, I'm not going to ask you, I'd probably get 10 different answers. Because information is something we intuitively understand. It's what we know about something versus perhaps what we don't know. But I'm going to offer a more formal definition, which will at first seem rather abstract and perhaps even a little abstruse, but it will all begin to make sense. Those of you who haven't seen me talk before, what I tend to do is try to explain complex neuroscientific topics and concepts in an easily digestible form. Often this involves some simplification. I'm saying this because there might be neuroscientists in the audience. Please forgive me. So, information is generated when a system selects between a finite number of distinct states. So, let's take a simple example, a coin. So, oh my God. Call it? Heads. Who said that? Wrong. This coin has no heads. However, it's a gift, it's a Japanese coin, but typically a coin will have one of two states. either a head or a tail. This could equally be described as a 1 or a 0, or a yes or a no, or a plus or a minus, or a black or a white. It doesn't matter. By the way, if you're thinking this displays some kind of support for Trump, it doesn't. Yeah? I know my audience. So whenever a system, a simple two-state system like this, selects with equal probability between one of two states, it generates perhaps the most fundamental unit of information, which all of you will be to some extent familiar with, and that is the bit. So here we have a blue and a yellow square. So the square can either be blue or it can be yellow. We could label that with a 0 or a 1, and it flips between those states. And when you select one state, crucially, it won't seem crucial now, but it will later, crucially, by selecting one state, it rules out the other state. And this is how the information is generated. So we say a two-state system encodes a single bit of information. Now, of course, we all know that computers use bits. They use large numbers of these simple two-state systems to generate very, very large amounts of information. So you can combine simple two-state systems, such as here we've got 2 forming a larger system, and now we've got 4 states. We've got blue, blue, yellow, yellow, blue, yellow, yellow, blue. So we've generated now more information by increasing the number of these simple two-state systems. And we can do that. Formally, this encodes 2 bits of information. So we can extend this with many, many of these very, very simple systems to generate vast amounts of very, very complex information. So this brings us back to the brain and the idea that the brain constructs a world from information. So let's take that idea and translate it into how we understand the brain to work. So when we're talking about the information generation in the brain, I'm really focusing on this outer layer of the brain, the cortex, this folded structure that forms the outer layer of your brain. So it's this part here. So if you actually look and dissect a cortex and actually examine it, you see lots of these little cells, these little neurons here, which form a very, very dense and complex network, but they form themselves into these cylindrical kind of structures called columns, cortical columns, thalamocortical columns. And these are thought to be the fundamental computational units of the brain above the level of the neuron. So in my talks, I normally represent these columns from above, sort of a bird's eye view. So this is kind of the columns from the side. They have a number of layers which are important for information processing, but we'll just look at them from above. So this is what you're seeing. You're seeing cortical columns. If you were to look at the cortex from a bird's eye view, kind of above like that, in microscopic level of detail, you would see a sort of a mosaic of these columns. And these columns, very, very highly kind of oversimplified sense, we can think of as either being active or inactive. So we can think of them perhaps being in the 0 state or the 1 state, the on state or the off state. So these grey ones here, we will say are off, and then you have yellow ones which are on. So now you should be able to think to yourself, this is generating information. Each of these cortical columns can switch between 2 states. And by combining very, very large numbers of these columns, we can generate vast amounts of information. And it's this information that is your phenomenal world, subjectively experienced from within. Now, when the brain selects one state, i.e. one particular pattern of column activation, it is ruling out vast numbers of other possible states. Think about the number of possible combinations of the billions of columns in your brain, and when your brain selects one, it rules out vast numbers of others. That means it generates vast amounts of information. That's the key to understanding information generation in the brain. So we can say each pattern of column is a single state of the cortex, which by ruling out vast numbers of other possible states encodes a huge amount of information. If you want to know exactly how much, this is kind of a ballpark figure, 2.5 million gigabits, which is a lot. Now, something else that the brain does, these columns aren't kind of just totally independent and kind of firing and switching on and off randomly, because that would generate an enormous amount of information, but it would be completely useless. Your brain has to generate a kind of a model of the world that is functional, that does its job, that allows you to make predictions and kind of orientate yourself and survive and reproduce, ultimately. So what the brain does is it sculpts that information by forming connections. There are a number of different types of connections. We're going to kind of collapse them down to these sort of simple lines between the cortical columns. And this allows the brain to sculpt the information by allowing columns to interact with each other. So when one column is active, it can speak to other columns and either switch them on, perhaps, or switch them off. And so this restricts the number of states that the brain can adopt, that the cortex can adopt, and provides a limited, what is now more and more becoming called a repertoire of states. So your world model, this model of the environment that Hermann Hesse wrote about 100 years ago, we now know is encoded by the pattern of activation of the columns, or in other terms, your world model is a highly complex pattern of information. And now you understand how that information is generated. Now, of course, that is incomplete, because, of course, this model isn't simply generated entirely internally, but has some kind of relationship to the environment. There's a mapping between what's going on out there, i.e. the information being generated in the so-called external world, and this world model which is being generated internally. Now, if you open a textbook, neuroscience textbook, you'll probably see something like this. So the information comes from the senses, the retina, let's say. It passes through a number of strangely labeled regions of the brain, which we won't worry about. And in a simplified sense, we can see that sensory information is passed to what we call sort of lower order areas of the cortex, or primary sensory areas. These are responsible for kind of representing very, very simple features of the world, lines, the orientation of lines, things like that. And then that information is passed to higher order levels, where things like texture and color will be picked out of that information and essentially generated. And then finally to these very high order areas of the brain, which actually are very much more specific and will responsible for generating the information that encodes things like faces or animals, etc. But this is kind of, we now understand this is a little bit, this kind of what we might call a bottom-up model of world building is probably not quite true. This is kind of how it would look in your traditional model, and relating this to our pattern of cortical column activation. The sensory information activates these lower order area and generates a specific pattern of activity. That information is then passed to the higher order and generates a pattern of activity there, which then by the connectivity then generates a pattern of activity there. But overall, despite this being a hierarchical system, overall you can see that the world is modeled as this unified pattern of cortical column activation. Okay. So this is a bottom-up information flow model. However, we now know actually that this is probably not quite correct, and that really the brain has a very good model of the world, and it doesn't require sensory information as such in order to construct that model. And you all know this. You've all, or most of you I assume, have had dreams when the sensory information is disconnected from the environment, and yet your brain is perfectly capable of building a very realistic, or in many senses identical model of reality. It has a number of differences which we'll talk about. So what we actually think is happening is that these higher order areas are actually predicting the activity, the pattern of activation that's going to happen in the lower order area, and then this lower order area predicts the pattern of activation in this even lower order area, and this lower order area is responsible for predicting the sensory information that it's going to receive. So this is some kind of pattern of sensory information coming from the environment. And when this works, everything's fine. The brain doesn't need to really do anything. Its model is correct. And this is a very economical way of working, by the way. You don't have, if the model is working, fine. However, sometimes the model will be incorrect, and the sensory information won't match the prediction. And then you'll get prediction errors. There's a discrepancy. Here represented by these pink columns showing errors in the model. So how does the brain deal with this? Put your cars away. How does the brain deal with this? So the original model is incorrect, and so what you do is you update the model. When you update the model, things work again. So this is kind of a summary of how this works. The brain generates a model of the world using information. The model is used to make predictions about expected sensory information, and these predictions are compared with the actual sensory information, and then any discrepancies are generate these prediction errors, and these prediction errors actually flow upwards through this sensory hierarchy, and then these prediction errors are used to refine the model. And this is going on all the time. So your brain is constantly testing its model against sensory information. And this gives us a clue, the first kind of clue of how we might think about the DMT world. The way that this sensed world, so the world we're all experiencing now, the way that it is modeled by the brain and continuously tested against sensory information gives it a number of properties. It's stable, it's predictable, and it's consistent. These are obviously essential. The world is not going to be useful if it isn't all of these things, and it has a number of other qualities as well. What you should notice about this is that we're actually thinking about the way the world is constructed and the properties of the world that are a consequence of the way the world is constructed. A sensed world has certain properties that are a direct consequence of the fact that it is a model that is constantly being tested against sensory data. So we'll relate that to the DMT world shortly. Now, when you descend into REM sleep at night, the normal kind of primary sensory areas, so this is an awake brain, which receives this sensory information at the back of the brain, the primary areas. These are kind of shut down during dreaming, as are these frontal areas as well, which normally provide sort of the critical faculties that would normally allow you to realize that this dream is getting rather weird. They kind of shut down as well, which is why you don't normally aware of the kind of the weirdness and bizarreness of dreams sometimes. Anyway, so your brain is left to build its model without access to sensory information. So normally when you're awake, as we've just seen, the model is being tested all the time against sensory information. However, in the dream state, no model testing is possible. So the brain is unable to constantly update and refine its model. Now that has a number of consequences for the structure of the world. So the dream world tends to be less stable. It's less predictable. It's less consistent. The scene might shift from the front garden to the inside of an aircraft. It becomes less predictable, and weird, illogical, irrational, perhaps impossible things can happen. So it loses the qualities of a sensed world, and this is a dreamt world, of course. Now, when you put a psychedelic into the brain, and again, I'm massively oversimplifying here, I won't go into the neurobiology, but I think the way I like to think about what psychedelics are doing, normally this connectivity that is organized into these networks maintains a degree of order and control over the information. Whereas when you add a psychedelic, you get kind of like a democratization of these cortical columns. And so they tend to adopt a larger number of states. You get an increase in the so-called state repertoire under the influence of psychedelics as the brain moves through these states much more freely. Also appears as an increase in the disorder or the entropy of the brain. Also, the brain becomes less capable of generating its model of the world. It's less successful in predicting sensory information, and as a result, you get increased prediction errors, which means actually that more information is flowing upwards. More information is actually flowing up from the environment into the brain. So how does that feel subjectively? So the brain selects from a larger number of states. That should immediately make you think, that means that it's generating more information, and that creates a richer world. The brain moves more freely between these states because these networks don't exhibit the same level of control. So the world becomes less stable, less predictable, more fluid, more dreamlike, one might say. And these increased prediction errors that are passed upwards through the sensory hierarchy are experienced as an increase in the sensitivity to sensory information. But what about DMT? With DMT, something altogether different seems to happen. So so this is kind of this is our normal kind of waking consensus world model. And when you take a normal dose of a psychedelic such as LSD or psilocybin or mescaline, you get this democratization of the cortical columns, you get this increase in entropy, and you enter a more fluid state. But when you smoke a breakthrough dose of DMT, something rather different happens. It's as if the brain is shifting to a completely different model, rather than simply a kind of distortion or an altered version, not a distortion, an altered version of its usual model. So then we can ask the question, skip that, is the DMT world a sensed world, or is it a dreamt world? Does it have the properties that we have already outlined and explained in terms of the world construction that a sensed world has? Is it a world model that is being tested against sensory information? If that's true, that suggests the brain is receiving information from some other source, and that would suggest that the DMT world is, in a sense, real. However, if the DMT state possesses more of the properties of a dreamt world, then that would make that assumption of reality a little bit more difficult to justify. So, if we think that the DMT world is a real world, this means the DMT world model is being tested against sensory information. So this is what happens, of course, in the normal waking world. We've got sensory information from the consensus world. And if the DMT world was indeed a sensed world, it would be, there would be some kind of data input from elsewhere, who knows. And the DMT world would exhibit the properties of a sensed world. What you should notice here, which I think is key, is that we're trying to get at the reality of the DMT world without trying to reach into it. Other people have proposed, we should get the elves to do mathematical problems. Can you give me the unique prime factors of this very large number, please? But I think this is perhaps not the best approach. It's difficult enough to get into our world as such, but to get into the DMT world, to reach into it and test it in some way, to kind of ask it to prove its reality, I think is a very difficult thing to do. But what this way of thinking allows us to do is to think about the way the world is constructed. And think, does the DMT world have properties of a sensed world or a dreamt world? If it's a dreamt world, then we should expect to see the properties of a dreamt world, and it would mean that the DMT world is indeed isolated from the environment, as Chris made the assumption of early in his lecture, and that is the kind of the orthodox assumption, is that it is a world that is isolated from the environment. Certainly isolated from this environment, but is it also completely isolated from all environments, or is there some other environment, some other place to which DMT gates access? So we might ask questions of the DMT state. Later on, I'm going to talk about a new continuous infusion technology I developed with Rick Strassman, which allows you to stay in the DMT state for perhaps many hours or days at a time at a kind of a breakthrough level. I'm not accepting volunteers, please don't email. And we could actually test the nature of the world, and these volunteers, these voyagers really would be able to examine the features and actually kind of map the qualities of the world and ask questions such as, is it a stable world? We think initially, no, it's not a stable world, it's a crazy wild world. But actually, I think the part of the problem with that is that most people stay in this breakthrough state for a very short period of time. The brain needs time to develop its model and to stabilize its model. And I think that will actually happen if you give somebody DMT over a much more extended period. We might ask the question, is it predictable? Is it consistent? Does it have these properties? So I kind of envisage a time in the future where we will develop a map of the qualities of the DMT space, and we will be able to make that comparison and say, does this world look like a world that is being dreamt or hallucinated, or does it look like a world that is in some sense being sensed? Okay, so just summarizing, not too over. So all phenomenal worlds are built from information generated by your brain. You now know exactly how that works. And we can imagine that sensed worlds and, imagined or dreamt or hallucinated worlds can be differentiated by their characteristics and the way they are constructed by the brain, rather than trying to get into the world in itself. And by identifying these particular phenomenological and neurological qualities of these different types of world would perhaps give us a way of finally answering that question of whether the DMT world looks more like a sensed world, in which case Chris and Robin will have a lot to answer for, or if it is, as they might lean towards, just a hallucinated world. And I will stop there. Thank you so much.